I am Margaret Harper, 70 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that putting others first was the measure of love. That evening, I had spent hours preparing dinner, my hands aching but my heart hopeful. The smell of roasted chicken and fresh vegetables filled the kitchen. The table set with my late mother's crystal glasses and polished silverware. I wanted everything to feel warm and welcoming, to create one peaceful night with my son and his wife. When Kendra walked in wearing a striking red dress, there was something in the way she carried herself that made my chest tighten. She looked around, her eyes glinting with a confidence I had learned to recognize as condescending. Daniel, my son, avoided my gaze, his fingers nervously fidgeting with his phone. My heart pounded, and yet I tried to keep my voice steady, reminding myself that this was my home and my effort that filled it with warmth. For a moment, I froze, the serving spoon still in my hand, when the words hit me like a sharp wind cutting through a quiet room. I realized that after everything I had done, every sacrifice, every quiet support, my presence was being dismissed, weighed, and found wanting. That single comment cut through decades of loyalty and love. I remembered the months before, the mornings I emptied my savings to cover their rent, believing it was a temporary measure, believing Daniel when he asked me to shield Kendra from the truth. Each month, $1,000 went out from my account, the money I had saved, stitch by stitch. Careful penny by careful penny. I had stretched my groceries, skipped doctor appointments, and even ignored my own aches and pains, telling myself it was worth it because they needed me. But now, watching Kendra smile as though she had rehearsed this moment, I felt a spark I hadn't in years, a spark that whispered it was time to stop hiding. My son's avoidance, the tension in his shoulders, the satisfaction on her face, they all became the backdrop to a choice I had not allowed myself to make before. It was in that moment, as the room hung in silence around me, that I understood the truth of my own power. For decades, I had believed my love was measured by sacrifice. But that night, I realized that love without boundaries could erase you. I knew then that whatever happened in the next few minutes, nothing would ever be the same. I carefully placed the serving spoon down and took a deep breath. I felt a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating. I understood that this confrontation would mark the first time in years that I spoke for myself, not just as a mother, but as a woman who deserved recognition, respect, and the right to reclaim her own life. As I looked at them, my son and his wife, I felt the tension tighten, but also a steady resolve rising inside me. This dinner, meant to please, had become the stage for revelation, and in the quiet, I felt the first taste of what it meant to stop being invisible. From here, I knew the path ahead would test every ounce of courage I had, but I was ready to follow it. It was a night of reckoning, and I could feel, deep in my chest, that change was finally at hand. I have lived in a small Ohio town for more than 30 years, in the same house filled with memories of raising my son, Daniel. Every corner of this home carries a story. The rocking chair in the living room still creaks from nights I stayed awake nursing his fevers. The quilt folded on the sofa is stitched from scraps of fabric left over from my sewing customers. Each square reminds me of time and care I poured into others. For years, I believed helping my family was the same as loving them. I didn't realize that sometimes helping too much can erase you until you no longer recognize yourself in the mirror. 6 months before that fateful dinner, Daniel had come to me with a worried expression, admitting he had lost his job and couldn't pay rent. My first instinct was to protect him, to make things right. I opened my savings account and began covering their rent $900 each month, plus $100 to the landlord's processing fee. I didn't tell Kendra because I thought I was preserving her pride, but really, I was shielding Daniel from his own accountability. To make it work, I cut corners in my own life. Dinner became rice and eggs night after night. I stretched my arthritis medicine until the pain kept me awake. I wore the same worn shoes until the soles split. And still, I told myself it was worth it because my son needed me. Meanwhile, Daniel and Kendra went out, bought new clothes, and posted pictures of weekend trips I knew they could not afford. I carried the burden quietly, believing someday they would recognize my sacrifices. I had spent decades teaching myself to put others first, to soften my voice, to keep peace, to hope for gratitude that never came. That night, I had wanted everything to be perfect. I prepared Daniel's favorite meal, set the table with my mother's crystal glasses, and polished the silverware. The aroma of vanilla pudding, his favorite since childhood, filled the air. I tried to focus on the hope that this evening could be different, that we could share laughter and warmth. But deep down, I felt a storm gathering. The tension between appearances and reality pressed down on every corner of the room. I remember wondering, as Kendra's red dress caught the light, if she realized the depth of the sacrifices I had made. Daniel seemed restless, avoiding my eyes, fingers tapping against his phone nervously. I had tried to believe in his honesty, but a small part of me had always sensed that truth was something he would bend to protect himself. As I carried dessert to the table, my thoughts drifted back to when Daniel was a boy, scraping every last bite from the bowl and telling me I was the best cook in the world. For a fleeting moment, I let myself imagine a gentle evening with love and laughter. But the shadow of Kendra's judgment loomed over the room, and I felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in my chest. It was in these quiet moments, before confrontation, that I realized how much I had given of myself, how many corners of my own life I had sacrificed, and how little recognition I had received in return. I understood that this dinner would not just be about a meal, it would be a turning point, a test of whether I could finally stand for myself. And as I set the pudding in front of them, feeling the tension tighten like a coil around the room, I knew that everything I had endured was leading to the moment when I would no longer stay silent. As we sat down to eat, the room felt smaller somehow, the air thick with tension I could almost taste. I carried each plate carefully, remembering the small joys of Daniel scraping the bowl clean as a boy, telling me I was the best cook in the world. I wanted that warmth again, even for a fleeting moment. But the way Kendra smiled at me now was sharp, measured, almost rehearsed. I realized she had waited for this exact evening, and her satisfaction made the air sting. Daniel avoided my eyes, his hands restless, tapping against the edge of the table. I could feel his discomfort, and I understood that he was trapped between me and Kendra, trying to protect her from the truth, even if it meant hiding it from me. The thought made my chest ache, a mixture of love and frustration, of longing for the son I had raised and the man I was now seeing. As dessert arrived, the vanilla pudding I had made with care, I carried it with the memory of his childhood laughter riding on my shoulders. But when I watched Kendra lean back, her eyes glinting, it became clear that the evening was about to change. Her words struck across the table like a blade, questioning not only my worth but my identity. For a moment, I felt frozen, my hands still gripping the spoon. The silence pressed in, the weight of years of sacrifice colliding with the present. And then the truth rose, steady and clear. I remembered every penny I had given, every sleepless night, every moment of my body and energy stretched thin to support them. I thought of the $1,000 I had been sending to cover their rent, and how I had been quietly carrying this burden alone. I realized it was time to speak, to let the truth stand between us without fear. I could feel my heart pounding, but my voice, when I finally allowed it to rise inside me, was calm, resolute. I placed the spoon down carefully, not in anger, but in purpose. I imagined telling them that the rent they had been relying on would no longer be my responsibility, that they would have to take ownership of their lives, their choices, and the consequences. Daniel's face drained of color, the tension in his shoulders visible, and Kendra's confident mask began to crack. I saw the surprise, the panic, and in that moment, I understood the power of truth when it is spoken firmly, without hesitation. Years of silence had shaped me, but now my boundaries were clear, and they could not ignore them. For the first time in decades, I was no longer invisible. I was standing tall, speaking my truth, and claiming the respect that had always been owed. I could feel the room shift, the air clearing with the weight of unspoken words now released. I had taken the first step in reclaiming my life, and the tension between us had reached its tipping point. Even as the room pulsed with awkwardness, I noticed the small details, the tilted glass, the subtle hesitation in Daniel's hands, Kendra's faltering gaze. These were signs that the truth had landed, and that change was inevitable. I understood then that the confrontation was not just about money or control. It was about recognition, about reclaiming dignity that had been overlooked for far too long. And as I left the table that evening, a quiet resolve settled over me. This confrontation had opened a door, and I could feel, deep in my chest, that the journey toward my own freedom and happiness was only beginning. The evening had reached its peak tension, but what came next, the reflection and the choices I would make for myself, would define the rest of my life. After Daniel and Kendra left that night, the house felt different, quieter, yet lighter, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. I stood in the kitchen, rinsing dishes beneath warm water, feeling the soap bubbles swirl and pop. My hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the release of years of carrying burdens that weren't mine to bear alone. For the first time in decades, I allowed myself to simply breathe. I thought about all the corners of my life I had neglected, all the moments I had stretched myself thin for others while shrinking my own dreams. I realized that unconditional love without boundaries had been a trap, and that I had spent too many years invisible, defined by what I gave rather than who I was. This understanding felt both terrifying and liberating. I had finally given myself permission to consider what I wanted, not what others expected. It was then that the phone rang, and hearing Tom Carson's voice transported me decades back. He was my college sweetheart, the boy who had promised me adventures and laughter by the Pacific Ocean. Time had moved on, but in his voice, I recognized the warmth and familiarity I had longed for. We spoke for hours that night, sharing pieces of our lives, our losses, and our small victories. I realized that after years of putting others first, there was space inside me to be seen, to be cared for, and to explore joy without guilt. I found myself making lists, weighing risks and opportunities. What if he had changed? What if the memory was sweeter than reality? And then I reminded myself that I was not running away from anything, I was choosing myself. The thought echoed quietly but insistently. I deserved a life that made my heart feel full. For the first time in years, I considered the possibility of adventure, of taking steps purely for my own happiness. Packing my suitcase felt different than it would have years ago. Each dress I folded was a statement of reclaiming space for myself, a small but potent act of self-respect. I thought of Daniel, not with anger, but with hope that this new boundary would allow him to learn responsibility. I reflected on the irony that for so long, I had equated love with sacrifice. In that silence, I understood that true love included the courage to let go of patterns that diminish rather than empower. Choosing myself was not selfish, it was essential. And as I set aside my carefully organized notes, I felt a quiet thrill, a sense of possibility that had been absent from my life for decades. I couldn't help but smile at the thought that at 70, I was finally embracing my own story, not as a supporting character in someone else's life, but as the author of my own experiences. I wondered if it was too late, if joy at this stage could truly feel as fresh as I imagined. But then I realized that the question itself was the wrong one. The real question was whether I would allow myself to take it. And in my heart, the answer was, finally, yes. The evening faded into a calm night, and as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Fear of stepping into the unknown, and exhilaration at the thought of finally living for me. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, I understood that my life was mine to shape. This clarity, this quiet empowerment, set the stage for what came next, a journey to reclaim not just my freedom, but the joy and love that had patiently waited all these years. When I boarded the plane to Seattle, I felt a mixture of nervous excitement and quiet determination. Each mile I traveled was a mile away from the life I had always defined myself by: caretaker, supporter, invisible presence, and a mile toward a life I was finally choosing for myself. The thought of seeing Tom again filled me with warmth I hadn't realized I had missed. It wasn't about reliving the past. It was about embracing a possibility I had long denied. Arriving in Seattle, the cool air and scent of the ocean welcomed me in a way that felt alive, almost like a fresh start for my soul. Seeing Tom waiting for me, older, lined with time, yet smiling as he once had in college, reminded me that some connections, some sparks, never truly fade. We walked along the beach, barefoot in the sand, the waves rolling beneath our feet, and I felt a kind of freedom I hadn't known for decades. During the days that followed, I realized that letting go of my old patterns didn't mean losing my family. It meant creating space for them and for myself to grow. Daniel began to show subtle changes. He admitted he had been sleeping in his car, that he had finally found work with modest pay, and that he was taking small steps to rebuild his life. I saw in his eyes humility and responsibility that had been absent before. I felt pride, not just in his progress, but in the fact that my choice to set boundaries had given him the push he needed to stand on his own. I spent mornings walking along the coast, afternoons talking with Tom about our dreams and regrets, and evenings watching sunsets over the Pacific. For the first time in years, I was not defined by the needs of others. I was Margaret Harper, a woman with stories, laughter, and a heart still open to love. I realized that healing doesn't come all at once, but each conversation, each quiet moment of joy, stitched me back together in ways I had long forgotten. Tom's children welcomed me warmly, sharing their own stories, and I felt included, valued, and free to be myself. I laughed without restraint, and I realized that choosing joy didn't diminish my past sacrifices. It honored them by proving that my life could still hold beauty and meaning. I also reflected on Daniel and Kendra, understanding that some people never change, and that was not my responsibility. Letting go of bitterness allowed me to focus on the people and experiences that nurtured me. I had taught my son to stand, and now it was his turn to walk his own path. By the end of the month, when I packed my belongings to return home, I did so not with dread, but with a sense of completion. I had reclaimed myself, embraced the possibility of love, and witnessed my family beginning to find their footing. I realized that happiness is not a gift others give us. It is a choice, a decision we finally grant ourselves. And as I looked back on the Pacific one last time, I whispered to myself that it was never too late to live fully, to love boldly, and to embrace the adventure that life still held. This chapter was mine, and I was ready to write the next with courage, grace, and a heart finally free. Looking back on everything, I realize now that my journey wasn't just about confronting my son and his wife, or about reclaiming the money and boundaries I had given away. It was about learning that love without limits can sometimes erase the person giving it, and that setting boundaries is not just an act of protection, it is an act of self-respect. I understand now that being a mother doesn't mean becoming invisible. It means raising children to stand, even if they stumble before they learn. At 70, I finally gave myself permission to choose my happiness. I chose adventure, connection, and the possibility of love with Tom. I chose to let go of bitterness, to embrace joy, and to honor myself in ways I hadn't dared for decades. I learned that it is never too late to start again, to explore, to rediscover what makes your heart feel alive. Watching Daniel begin to rebuild his life, seeing him take responsibility, and realizing that Kendra would follow her own path, I understood that true love also involves letting go. I learned that some lessons must be experienced, that some people must find their own way, and that my role is not to carry their burdens at the cost of my own life. If you are listening to my story, I hope you hear this. You are not too old, too late, or too small to choose yourself. You can decide to stand up, to set boundaries, and to allow yourself the happiness you deserve. Life is not a rehearsal, and it is never too late to write the story you want for yourself. I encourage anyone who has spent years caring for others, giving more than they receive, or feeling invisible in their own life, to pause and consider what freedom might look like if you finally prioritized your own heart. Imagine what it would feel like to wake up each day knowing that your choices belong to you, that your happiness is valid, and that you are allowed to chase your own dreams, no matter your age. I share this story not as a boast, but as a reminder and an invitation. If I could take these steps at 70, so can anyone listening. Choose yourself, stand tall, and allow yourself the life you have always deserved.